Hello, dear friends. I would like to say some words that I said on Shabbat in the Minyan in Yerushalayim, where I usually give a Dvar Torah on Big Knesset Har El on Shairot Street, for those who are in the area. And this Shabbat was Parshat Beshalach. We were referred to as Shabbat Shirah, the Sabbath of the song. And the Talmud already says that Bizchut Nashim Tzadkaniot Yatzanu Mitzrayim, by the merit of righteous women did we leave Egypt. I think I mentioned that already in Parshat Shmot, right at the beginning of the book, that you have different righteous women right at the beginning of the book of Shmot. You have, of course, Shifra and Pua, who, according to the simple meaning of the Pshat, are possibly Jewish or non-Jewish midwives who don't want to, it actually seems more that they're non-Jewish by what they say, who don't want to kill the male sons. And then in addition, you have, of course, Yocheved and Miriam. We're up to 4. Yocheved, Miriam, who, according to the Midrash, also tells her parents, you have to have children, because if Pharaoh said not the sons, but he didn't make a decree against the daughters, and if you don't have children, you're doubling his decree. And of course, Yocheved and Miriam who watches Moses in the bulrushes in the Nile. And then Pharaoh's daughter, who comes also to watch, of course, to take Moses from the Nile. And then if you want, even Pharaoh's daughter's servant, who picks Moses out of the Nile. And then Tzipporah, who saves Moses' life in the story of the angel of God that wanted to kill, according to the simple meaning of the Pshat, wanted to kill Moses for not circumcising his son. So you had 7 different women there who saved the day. But in general, it says Nashim Tzadkaniot. And here too we see a difference between the way Moses leads the men of Israel in singing the Song of the Sea and the way Miriam leads the Song of the Sea for the women. Now, let me show you something interesting in the Onkelos. Onkelos is a first-century translation of the Torah into Aramaic. It's the first authorized edition of the Torah in a language which is not Hebrew, authorized by the rabbis, I mean. Because the Septuagint, which was done early on, possibly in the 3rd century before the Common Era, was a translation into Greek which was not authorized by the rabbi. It was sort of forced upon them by Ptolemy, the king of Egypt at the time, and they agreed to it. And there's even, I would say that there's an ambivalence in the Midrash in its relationship to the Targum, to this translation into Greek. But Onkelos was definitely sanctioned, authorized translation, and it was used in the synagogues, probably in Babylonia, to translate the Torah for those who spoke Aramaic as their lingua franca. So it says in Onkelos, Az Yashir Moshe. Now, Onkelos usually gives an exact translation, a literal, as opposed to, let's say, Yonatan ben Uziel or Targum Yerushalmi. But in this case, sometimes he deviates from that, and it's always interesting. So he translates, then Moses and the people of Israel and the children of Israel sang this song. We're talking about the Song of the Sea. Onkelos translates, Uvechein Shabach Moshe b'nei Yisrael, which means they gave praise, meaning Moses and the people of Israel gave praise. Instead of using the term song, he says shevach or tushbachta. So meaning that this is a song of praise. But if you turn to the end when it talks about into chapter 15, verse 20, it says Miriam, of course, who's referred to as a prophetess here, which she was, but it's interesting they refer to her that way. The sister of Aaron took the tambourine, or took the drum with her, Toph, and she went in front of all the women. They all sang together with her, with drums and with dancing. And according to our understanding, they sang the same song again, all the women of Israel. And Miriam said to them, Shiru Lashem ki ga'oga, sing to God because he is exalted. Sus rochvora mavayam, horses and carriages, meaning of Pharaoh's men, have fallen into the sea. And here the Unglus translates differently. He says in the verse 21, Miriam said, Shabachu, praise, ve'odu, and give thanksgiving and gratitude before God, because he has been mighty and exalted. So when the men say the Song of the Sea, it says give praise. When the women do, it says give praise and thanksgiving. According to Unglus, Miriam explained that we also have to give thanksgiving and show gratitude. It's not enough to give praise. You've got to show gratitude, which is which reminds me of course, the Talmud in Sanhedrin. The Talmud said in Sanhedrin about King Hezekiah, one of the last kings of Judah. It says that God wanted to make Hezekiah the Mashiach, the Messiah, but he could not, because after saving Jerusalem from the siege of Sancheriv, the king of Assyria, Hezekiah never sang a song, Lo Amar Shirah, which means never gave praise or possibly never gave gratitude. Sometimes you have to say thank you. Especially if you're the king representing the people, you have to say thank you. So he couldn't make him the Messiah because of that. So Miriam brings in a very important ingredient, and not just praise, it's also thanksgiving, it's also gratitude. By the way, in our Shmona Esrei, in our silent rendition, our silent prayer, which is the main part of the 3 daily prayers, the morning service, the afternoon service, the evening service, Shachrit Ben Chamara, you have 3 benedictions of adoration, of praise, and the last 3 benedictions are gratitude. The ones in the middle are requests, general requests for the people, that requests. So Miriam then is singing the Song of the Sea and teaching us the importance of gratitude. Now we have a very interesting piece, I would say, in the second half of this parasha, which seems to connect to different things, and I'd like to explain. Moses takes the people from Yam-Suf, and they go to the desert of Shur, and they go 3 days without finding water. Now, this is interesting because you can compare this to the book of Genesis. When Sarah says to Abraham, I want you to expel Hagar, the servant, and her son Ishmael, and Abraham didn't want to until God said, yes, if Sarah told you something, do it. He sends them to the desert of Shur, the same place. And they go with very little water, and they're looking for water. So this is the second time it's mentioned in the Torah, looking for water in the desert of Shur, which is interesting. But I will continue in the meantime. And they come to a place called Marah. Vayavo Marata. Mar means bitter. And they couldn't find any water in Marah. Ki marim hem, because the water was bitter. And therefore it was called Marah. And the people, of course, complained. And they said, well, because there's no water. I mean, 3 days, that's a long time in the desert. They said, what are we supposed to drink? And Moses cried out to God, and God, Yorehu, very interesting word, it's almost like taught him that there's a tree. And he took this tree, which according to our tradition was a hurduf, which is a bitter tree, threw it into the water. The water became sweet water. And then it finishes off by saying something very unusual. At that place, did Moses teach the people through God, chok umishpat, which are, you might say, the laws and the statutes of Judaism. V'sham nisau, and there they were also tested. And God said, if you listen to my words, and Moses said, if you listen to the words of God and walk in the ways that are upright in his eyes, and listen to his commandments and keep all his statutes, all the different plagues that I brought upon Egypt, I will not bring upon you, because I am God, your healer. And here the word for plagues is machala, which means sickness. Now let me show you how this connects to the previous story. Miriam. Let's take the name Miriam. Miriam, you have mar, which means bitter, and yam, which is the sea. So let's start with the second part. She's the one who, after crossing the sea, takes the women, and they're going to show gratitude and not just praise to God. That's the yam. But what about the mar? What about the mar? The bitter. That's the next story. The next story is they're looking for water, and they can't find it. And they go to Mara, from the word bitter, mar. And kimarimhem, the waters are bitter. The word marim are the same letter as Miriam. And therefore they called it Mara, because the waters were bitter. How does this all connect? Now we know that there were three miracles, according to our tradition, that happened in the desert through the 40 years. One of them was called the Be'er of Miriam, which means the well of Miriam. The well of Miriam, according to the Midrash, was a stone that would roll together with the people as going through the desert. When it would stop, Moses hit that stone, water would come out of it. Only one time was he told to talk to the stone, but that's another thing. And in Marah, he hits the stone and water comes out. And that was, of course, by the merit of Miriam. So Miriam's name also, Maryam, the bitterness of the sea, can become drinking water if God wills it. Of course, in Israel today, we have desalination, so we're sort of familiar with things like that. But it's very interesting. And they take this tree, I guess that ties in with Tu B'Shvat, which is tonight, and they put the tree into the water, and almost like the water is desalinated through the tree, or somehow purified by the tree. Not clear. But the interesting thing says, Vayorehu Hashem eitz. Not he showed him, Vayarehu with an aleph. Yorehu, he taught him that there's a tree, and put this tree in. And then once he puts the tree in, all of a sudden they're taught the laws and the precepts of the Torah. And this is the end of experiment 1, Sham Nisahu. What does this mean? So the people are walking into the desert, but they just saw the most miraculous thing. They saw God interfere with nature, split the Red Sea, destroy their enemies in the Red Sea. They should have a little more faith in that. The problem is not that they're 3 days in the water and that they in the desert that they want water. It's the way they want it. It says vayilonu, which means they complained. You don't complain, you ask. You realize that it can't happen. You say, Moses, please ask God for water. Don't start complaining. The things that you saw before, you should understand. You don't have to complain, you have to ask. So this was seen as something wrong. That's why the people are taught the laws. But there's one other thing that has to be pointed out here. And I want to continue the story in order to make this point, okay? Right after here, there's another stop. And the stop is called Elima. Now, this is a very unusual stop, even more unusual than the previous one. Because it says that there in Elima, there were 12 there were 12 fountains of water, which means springs of water. And there were 70 date trees. And that's where they finally camped. Now, the strange thing is that the story, first of all, why do we have to know that there were 12 springs and 70 date trees? Just say there are springs and date trees. And secondly, in Parshat Maseh and Bamidbar, when they talk about the stops of the Israelites in the desert, again, they say that at Lima there were 12 springs and 70 date palms, even though on the other stops they don't say anything. They just say these were the stops. Twice then in the Torah, they have to give us this information. Now there's a Midrash Mechelta, and the Midrash Mechelta is a halachic, a legal Midrash on Shmot. But on the occasion, it says non-legal interpretations, and this is one of the occasions. And the Mechilta says, what are the 12 springs? They represent the 12 tribes. Each tribe has its water source, which means its connection to God, because God is the water source, meaning the one who gives life. Now, on this world, on this planet, Miriam is the one who, because of her merit, you have the be'er, the movable well that goes with him in the desert. Why? Because the woman is always represented by the well. Remember that Isaac's wife, Rivka, was met by Abraham's servant at the well. And Jacob meets his two wives. He meets Rachel, his wife, at the well, and then later on Leah. And Moses meets his wife, Zipporah, Yitro's daughter, at the well. The woman represents the well. The well is spring water. It's life. It gives life. And women have the ability to bring a child into the world that gives life. So it's Miriam who represents the water, the bitter water turning into sweet water, which is the act of life. You have the bitter water, if you want, the seminal drop that turns into an actual life through the woman. And then you have, of course, the Be'er of Miriam, which goes with them in the desert. So each one of the tribes is attached to its spring, which is its divine source. And every tribe has its relationship to God, but the tribes have to get together as one. Even if they're slightly different in their understanding, it's okay. You can have different ways to getting to God, but you also have to unite as a people. And the second thing is the Shivim Tmarim, the 70 date trees. What are the 70 date trees? According to the Mechilta, it's the 70 elders, the 70 heads, or the Zakenim, the elders who teach Torah. Why does 70 represent Torah? Because in Parshat Beshalach, we didn't have the Torah yet. This is before the 10 Commandments was received. This is before Moses wrote the 5 books of the Pentateuch, which happens during the desert. So the Torah is given verbally by the elders, by the 70 elders, who are the ones who represent the judges, like we found earlier in the Torah. So the Torah is the 70 elders, and the 12 springs represents the connection of each tribe to its spiritual and physical source, but more so its spiritual source. So when the people are looking for water in the desert, they have to understand you can't live without water, but you can't live without the precepts of the Torah too. Because physically you can't live without water, but as a nation and spiritually, you cannot live without these precepts of the Torah. So at the same time that they find water in the Marah, they're also given the precepts of the Torah. But there's another thing going on here too. And that is, as I said, they go to Marah, and the main word there is Mar, which means bitter, which is also the first part of Miriam's name. In the word bitter, if you switch it around, is also Ram. And Ram is something which is high up. But it's also to be arrogant. And the Hebrew called that Ram Levavcha. You become haughty of heart, and you become arrogant. Ram Levavcha, and then you forget God. So the bitter waters, the Marah, also represents the fact that the people sometimes forget that God is in their midst. That's why Ram is also the gematria, numerical value of Amalek, who we're going to fight at the end of this chapter. They're the ones who want to bring the Safek, which is also 240 in numerical value, to bring the skepticism into somebody's mind. And this is the Mar. This is the bitterness. And when it says Vayilonu ha'amal Moshe, that they complained, the word Vayilonu, the numerical value, the gematria, is the same gematria 102, which is the gematria of emunah, which is faith. Because they should have had faith that God can give them water. You don't complain, you request. So when Moshe called out to God, Vayorehu, God taught them the tree. Now the teaching of the Torah is called the tree of life. He taught them the tree. And first, he gave them the purified water, but then he gave them the chok, which are the precepts which are not self-evident, the mishpat, which are the precepts are self-evident, which, according to the Midrash in the Mechilta too, and Rashi, is the chok was para aduma, the red heifer, and of course Shabbat, and the mishpat were the dinim, which are the laws between man and man, laws of courts, etc., of society, which were also taught to them. And this was the first test to see if they would have faith, and it looks like they didn't pass well this first test. And then Moses said, if you listen to the precepts of God, it will help you in your life, because God can give healing. He can heal the body and he can heal the soul. And then to go to Elima. Why to Elima? Elima are the letters Elohim, which is God's name, the exact letters. In other words, if you're on the level that God wants, then each one of the tribes is like a spring of water, and each one has its connection to God. And those 70 elders will teach you the Torah. And then you'll have Tamar, as a friend of mine said in the synagogue. Tamar is Tam-mar. It's the end of the bitterness. It's bringing meaning into your life, and meaning into your life is sweet waters. Then it continues, and it talks about the man. Now, according to our tradition, if the bear of Miriam, the well of Miriam, was by the merit of Miriam, so the man was by the merit of Moses. And the people, and it says here that the people complained a second time on the 15th day of Iyar. Why the 15th day of Iyar? It's put in the Midrash, because in the 15th day of Iyar, the bread, or you might say the unleavened bread that they prepared when leaving Egypt, ran out. So he said to Moses, not only do we need water, we need to eat. We remember in Egypt, we sat next to the pot of meat, and we were eating bread as much as we wanted. You wonder about that a little bit. So, and why are you bringing us out here to the desert to die? God says to Moses, I'm going to give them lechem min hashamayim, bread from the heavens, and they will pick it up every day. That's the man. And in the morning, you'll see God's glory, because God heard your complaints. And God will give you, and Moses says, will give you in the evening, you'll get meat, and in the morning you'll have bread. The meat, of course, is the slav, the quails that fall in the evening, which will be mentioned in the Parshat Bamidbar. And so this is what happens. In the evening, the slav, it's also mentioned here, the slav, the quails, fell in the evening so that they have these birds to eat. And in the morning, they had the man. And it says the children of Israel saw this unusual bread that fell in the morning. And they said one to another, manhu, kiloyadu mahu, which means, what is it in Aramaic? Because they didn't know what it was. And Moses said, this is the bread that God gave you to eat. And this is what you'll pick up. But you'll pick it up daily. You won't keep it for the next day. It's to teach you faith. This is the man. And now, so the man was given in the way it's given on a daily basis. You can't keep it for the next day, or it turns into worms. Some of them tried it. Only on the Friday will it fall twice, because it won't fall on the Sabbath. But it's to teach you faith in God that God gives you every day. And then, by the way, the book of Deuteronomy and Devarim, in Parshat Ekev, it says about the man. Leman hoti achatz, it was to teach you that man does not live on bread alone. Meaning it was not easy eating the man, which it doesn't actually say here, but it does say in Devarim. So man was to teach you to trust in God. God will give you what you need today. He'll give you what you need tomorrow. Don't complain. You'll see it happen. And that's why it was called man, because they said, manhu, what is it? And the letters manhu, if you play around with them, it's emunah, which means faith. It's to teach you faith. So first, the water was to teach you faith. And the second one's the bread, was to teach you faith, that man does not live on bread alone, but on the word of God. And also to teach you the faith of God. If God says you'll get man every day, you'll get man every day. And finally, at the end of the parasha, it says again that the people were thirsty for water. And again, it says that they complained against Moses and said, "Why did you take out of Egypt to have us die in the desert out of thirst?" Happens again. And again, Moses hits the rock and water comes out. And there, the people tested God, it says, which is negative. When they said, Hayesh Hashem b'kibenu ayin, is God in our midst or not? And that was lack of faith. And therefore it says, Vayavo Amalek. Amalek came. Amalek is the same numerical value as the word Ram. As I say, hottiness of heart. Ram lavavcha. It's also the gematria of the word Safek. They had a doubt. And therefore, they fought the people. They come out to fight the people of Israel. And Moses stands on the rock, and Joshua and Hur hold Moses' hands. When Moses' hands were raised, the Israelites were winning in the battle. And when his hands were down, the Amalekites were winning. And Moses' hands were very heavy. And so Hur and Joshua had to hold up his hands. Vayhi adav emunah, and his hands were faithful until morning. Why were the hands of Moses faithful? Because in that fight against Amalek, it became clear to the Israelites that they're fighting for their own identity as a people and for their own freedom. They didn't just leave Egypt. They have to fight for their freedom sometimes. This clarifies their faith in themselves and in God and the leadership of Moses. And because of that, Moses' arms become lifted up. It is an act of faith, emunah. And then the safek, which is Amalek, the ram, the haughtiness disappears, and the skepticism disappears, and Amalek is taken over and falls. So all this then starts off with Miriam, continues all the way to the question of Mara and Elima and Amalek, and it's all this nisayon, this testing the people in the questions of faith. Can they become the people, God's chosen people, to teach faith to the world, to teach God's precepts to the world? This is the laboratory, this desert, in which it is happening. And I want to mention one last thing, especially because we're still in this war that started on October 7th. It's not completely finished. Faith, tests in life teach us faith. The vicissitudes of life help us grow, unfortunately. Sometimes we can't grow without these difficulties. God doesn't want there to be wars. Sometimes if people don't stand up for what they believe in, for their freedoms and for their rights, then there is no real human life anymore. We all become subjected to or taken over by dictators or evil people. Sometimes we have to stand up and fight. When we fight, it clarifies what we really believe in. God says to the Israelites, I gave you all these trials. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. So I want you to fight Amalek. When you fight Amalek, it'll become clear to you what you really have to believe in. We've just had a war, started October 7, 2023, Simchat Torah. And when the war first happened, a lot of people were skeptical about this young generation, the millennials, the ones who live on Twitter and TikTok and Facebook. And are they the ones who can actually stand up, rise up to the occasion to defend the people? And the first week, you had media people interviewing young soldiers going out to the battle and asking them about how they feel. We are a democracy. You can talk to the soldiers. It's not a problem. A lot of them are miluim, which means not in the regular army, but in the reserves. In fact, the majority are in the reserves. So they're just normal people going out to fight. Remember one time he interviewed this young guy, 20 years old, maybe 21, probably just months after his army service. And going back in to fight. He said to him, are you nervous? Said, why should I be nervous? He says, well, you're going out to battle. I mean, says, you're asking me if I'm nervous about dying in battle. Says, well, yeah, I guess. Says, let me put it this way. I'm going out to fight for my people, for my family, for my friends. The answer is no. I'm not nervous. I know exactly what I'm doing. This became an impressive young generation with powers that we didn't even know that they had, with talents and abilities and commitment which went far beyond expectations. And they rose up to the occasion. We hope that war is not the things that we will need. We hope that education will solve the problems, both for us and for our enemies' children too, because we don't want war. But when war happens, you have to stand up to defend yourself, your freedoms, your beliefs, your values, and not let darkness take over the world. But the ultimate goal, kulam yeduati, that everybody know God, from the smallest to the largest, that swords be beaten into plowshares, and out of Zion shall come forth the Torah and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Shalom, shalom.